Bridgetower's fame dissipated. So I couldn't find out much more about Bridgetower, so I started looking at Beethoven and the Kreutzer Sonata. And I said, why is it called Kreutzer? And I found out that after he dedicated it to Bridgetower and then tore up the dedication, he offered the honor of having the sonata named after him to another violinist, a French violinist by the name of Rudolf Kreutzer, who took one look at it and said, this is too hard, nobody can ever play this. Beethoven doesn't understand the violin, this is impossible. What Kreutzer didn't realize was that Bridgetower had already played it. He premiered it, in fact, and he premiered it, parts of it sight unseen. But more of that later. I began to get really, really intrigued by this young mixed-race man to figure out what was it like to be him. And I came to the project with lots of misconceptions, preconceptions, I guess you could say. I came to it thinking, well, he was going to meet just incredible blasts of racism. I came to it thinking that the dedication that Beethoven wrote on the sonata, which we still have the one, that this was an insult, because the Beethoven dedication was in Italian. It was per il mulatto Bridgetower, gran pazzo e compositore mulatico. In other words, for the mulatto Bridgetower, great pal and mulatto composer. And I thought he said mulatto twice. What's up with this? I assumed that, and the deeper I got, the more I realized that I came to it with my 20th century sensibilities, that the word mulatto at that time was simply a designation, just like you would say someone has a quadroon or someone has, red hair. It was what he was, and that in fact they had a fairly loving relationship until until it fell apart, which is probably why it was such a vehement falling apart. They had a loving relationship, and in fact, Beethoven had problems of his own in terms of identity, because people would call him behind his back the Moor. He said he was dark enough to be a Moor. So it was complicated. Let's put it that way. It was complicated, and when I began to realize all of that, I realized I had to go in even deeper and try to find out if there was any other way I could approach this story. And then I had a stroke of fantastic luck. I contacted the British Library, and I was looking for different things, and got copies of the article from the Musical Quarterly that had been published in Great Britain, and looked at all the back story to it and the notes. And there was a reference to a woman by the name of Charlotte Poppendiek, who they said had been responsible for the first concert that the little boy Bridgetower had ever given. And I said, who in the world is Charlotte Poppendiek? And then I found out she had been the wardrobe mistress to the Queen of England. And on a whim, I began looking her up, and I discovered that she had written a diary. No one knew Charlotte Poppendiek from a hole in the wall, but when she was old and no longer in service to the Queen and depressed, her children, thinking to amuse her, said, "Mom, you really should write down what you've gone through in your life." And they gave her the project of writing down what had happened to her while she was a wardrobe mistress. So she wrote this humongous, it's 2 volumes of stuff, all from memory of what her life had been like. It's because she was a wardrobe mistress, it's full of clothes. which is also kind of wonderful. Everything is shaded through, well, so-and-so wore the pink silk yesterday, but what they did in that pink silk. It was so wonderful to read, and I read, all of it, and there were 4 mentions of Bridgetower in this whole thing. And that started me on the path to trying to figure out his life through a woman who essentially nobody noticed, and yet she did this phenomenal thing to help restore another life. And so let me put another poem out in the air, and then I'm going to take you kind of hopscotch you through some aspects of the book and also share with you some of the backstories behind it. I'm going to start with the very first poem in the book, which was not the first poem I wrote, incidentally. I think it was pretty much one of the last, but it was the one that, it was the thing that kept me going through the whole thing. I was not interested in making this into a suspense story. We knew the ending already. We had the sonata already. And I also was, in that sense, I was not interested in making it into a novel or even into writing a standard biography. You might ask, why would I then try to put a whole life into poems? And the easy answer is to say, it's what I do, The next easiest answer is to say that's sort of like asking, why do you fall in love with X or Y, and not Z? But because I do love the cage that poetry gives me, because it allows you to sing, and it allows you to take things in very intense doses. But I think the more difficult answer to that would be that I feel that poetry gets at the spine of utterance. And we as human beings, all animals have some kind of utterance of some sort. Well, not all of them, but almost all animals have some kind of verbal utterance. Ducks quack and geese honk and dogs bark and all of that. But we have a structure. We have a structure of communication that we all acknowledge is only a structure. In other words, we know that all the words that we use don't say exactly what they mean. And we know that every word stands for something else. We can say, fear, and we know that there are 10,000 kinds of fear. And so we wait for some indication from whoever's talking to give you an idea of what kind of fear that is. And so we already know that we're playing against silence, and that silence is a big player in this. That means that I think for a poet to be able to say, here we are, right here at the you could almost say at the anthropological beginnings of human self-knowledge, right? And we're going to work with the words, and I just love being at that position. And I realized what I wanted to do was not to tell you the story again, even though you may never have heard it, of George Bridgetower, but to establish some connection between his life, his interior life, and our interior lives. I wanted you to feel like, I felt like that before. Oh, I know how he felt. And that's why I did not want to just give you the story. So this very first poem in the book tells you the whole story. So you don't have to worry about that anymore. You have the plot, okay? The Bridgetower. If was at the beginning. If he had been older, if he hadn't been dark, brown eyes ablaze in that remarkable face, if he had not been so gifted, so young a genius with no time to grow up, if he hadn't grown up undistinguished, to an obscure old age. If the piece had actually been, as Kreutzer exclaimed, unplayable, even after our man had played it and for years no one else was able to follow, so that the composer's fury would have raged for naught,